All right. Thank you. So my name is Ione Smith, and I'm here today to talk about Farmland Advantage. I am the program manager for this project, which is being administered by the Investment Agriculture Foundation. I'm a professional agrologist, and I work with Upland Agricultural Consulting, and we've been working in the realm of ecosystem services, climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and farming for 13 years now. I'm going to start off just by explaining a little bit of the history of the program itself, and then talk about the process, and then specifically describe a bit more about ecosystem services, and then discuss what we've done in the last couple of years and how things are going to be progressing in the next year or so. So just to start from the beginning, Farmland Advantage was developed by a rancher named Dave Zender, who lives in the East Kootenays near Invermere. And he was at the time in contact with family members in Switzerland, in Europe, and noted that there was some pretty innovative programming going on whereby farmers were being brought to the table and being paid essentially to keep ecosystem services on their properties thriving. And then more that he learned about it, the more he realized other parts of North America were also starting to undertake some of these initiatives. And he thought that it would be a great opportunity to introduce something similar in British Columbia. So it is a payment for ecosystem services program. It involves contracts with farmers and ranchers to protect and enhance natural environments. And primarily, so far, Farmland Advantage is working in two different key ecosystems. One is riparian areas, and that's predominantly in the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island. And the other one is in the natural grasslands areas in the interior Okanagan and Kootenays. It's part of a nature-based solutions approach to climate change adaptation and mitigation, which is just a fancy way of saying it's letting nature do the work, the hard work of flood mitigation, of cleaning water, of keeping our air clean, providing habitat for species at risk, and so on. One of the more popular programs in Canada is called the ALIS program, and that's based in Alberta, the prairies, and parts of Ontario as well. And so when Dave put together Farmland Advantage, he did it at a pilot scale for several years, just cobbling together funding whenever possible to try and get a sense of what the uptake rates would be amongst farmers. And it did really, really well. Pretty much every year, he had over 99% of farmers interested, want to keep going and want to reapply. And it captured the interest of the provincial government and Investment Agriculture Foundation, who has now been involved in bringing it to a provincial scale over the last couple of years. The way it works is that Farmland Advantage targets farms, specifically in pre-identified areas that indicate high value ecosystem criteria. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, using GIS or Geographic Information Systems. So looking at online mapping tools and multiple layers of information basically being used to filter out which areas have the highest values. It's not the same as the Environmental Farm Plan or the BMP or Beneficial Management Practices programs, but it's complementary to them. The main difference is that if you'd like to be part of the Environmental Farm Plan, you can apply and everyone is eligible. Whereas for Farmland Advantage, because it's a targeted program, we come to you essentially to ask if you would like to participate. As I mentioned, we're currently focusing on two ecosystems, riparian and grasslands, but with additional funding in the years to come, we may broaden it to estuaries, wetlands, and other ecosystems. Farmers are approached, as I mentioned, and if they're interested, then there is a planning advisor, usually a professional agrologist or biologist, who will undertake a riparian or a grasslands health assessment, and then work with the farmer to come up with a prescription for restoring those areas that are degraded. Then partners such as LEPS in the Bertrand Creek watershed where we're working, or other restoration partners, and sometimes the farmers themselves are engaged to undertake the field work to do the actual restoration. And then, as I mentioned, the farmers are paid some financial incentives to maintain the work that's done. At the moment, the payment to farmers is $1,500 per year, and there is a verification and auditing process that occurs to make sure that the restored areas are being maintained properly. The intent really is long-term engagement. As we know, it can take many years for habitats to become restored. So this is not supposed to be a one-off kind of flash in the pan type of program. We're looking at long-term contracts, which really just depends on how much funding the program can bring in from various levels of government in order to sustain itself. One thing that's been really critical is partnering with Indigenous communities. There are incredible opportunities to align and elevate goals. And so it provides lots of opportunities to partner and to celebrate success. This photograph here is Chief Barb Cote from the Shuswap Indian Band. And we hosted an event in partnership with the Shuswap Indian Band in the fall of 2021. Where we were celebrating the Farmland Advantage Program in the Shuswap Indian Band territory in the Upper Columbia River Valley. And it was a great opportunity to break bread, share salmon, and really talk about mutual priorities and mutual values around ecosystem restoration. It's not often that Indigenous communities come together with farming communities to work on projects together. So it's been really nice to highlight and showcase some of these successes. I mentioned ecosystem services a few times. So I just quickly want to review what they are for those who aren't necessarily familiar with them. There's 4 key services. So this slide shows the first 2, the supporting and the regulating services. So supporting services are necessary for ecosystem health, and they're also the foundation for all other services. And so some examples would be habitat and biodiversity provisioning, photosynthesis, soil development, nutrient cycling, and so on. The second is the regulating services, and these are those that provide regulators or balancing within the ecosystem itself. So everything from regulating temperature, regulating carbon, regulating air quality, pollination, etc., falls under the regulating services. Third is provisioning, so products and materials that our ecosystems provide for us. So the critical ones there are fish, water, food, and wood. And then fourth is cultural, so non-material benefits of the ecosystems. And those tend to relate more directly to our enjoyment of the outside world. So looking at things like the beautiful landscapes or recreation opportunities, human health, wellness, and tourism. So these are the 4 categories, and there's multiple examples under each really that can grow and come to fruition based on some of the protection of ecosystem services on farmland. So I wanted to just review some of the key achievements that we undertook in the last year. So you can see these little black dots. I'm going to be able to zoom in on them later on, but there's some small dots here. These represent the sites that we worked on. And so what we did is Investment Agriculture Foundation staff hired a project manager, that's me, a project assistant, and a project advisor, so that's Dave Zender. We put together critical governance structures like working groups, strategic plan, and operational plans. We recruited and trained up all the planning advisors who do the important site assessments. And we put together some templates for contracts, not only for the planning advisors, but for the farmers themselves. We also made sure that the health assessments and site prescriptions were up to date in terms of the best science and the best methodologies. And we partnered with subject matter experts to do that. We also tightened up our site selection methodology tool to ensure that it's robust and that it can withstand scrutiny and criticism, which is important. And we were lucky enough to secure some longer term funding. So these were all kind of these nuts and bolts pieces that don't necessarily get a lot of attention during a pilot project. And so once there's funding in place, it's important to get these ducks in a row, so to speak. So that was all work that was undertaken in that year. We also set a goal for 50 farms to be participating in Farmland Advantage within the first year. And the reason why this was particularly ambitious was because we didn't actually secure all of our funding until June of 2021. So we're working on fiscal year ends of March 31st to align with the province. So it gave us really 9 months to get everything done for our first 50 sites. I mentioned a little bit about the site targeting. So the way that works is we've been contracting with some GIS specialists, and they've created a set of beautiful maps for us that help us really kind of zoom in and figure out which water courses. So this, for example, would be for the riparian targeting, to figure out which water courses are most high risk and require the most attention in terms of restoration. So there's 6 specific categories that we look at, and these help us determine what those so-called hotspots are. And the mapping layers are just simply added on top of one another to determine some of the indicators and criteria. So the 6 key categories is, first of all, the land has to be in the agricultural land reserve in the ALR. It must be classified as a riparian area or a wetland. So we're taking, a specific kind of setback distance from watercourses. It must be adjacent to a sensitive stream as classified by the province. A species at risk has to have been known to occur on the land. The land itself is identified as critical habitat for a species at risk, and land is connected to fish or salmon-bearing streams. So it does help to whittle away and some of the sites and help us figure out specifically what to target. So on this map, the total scoring from those 6 would show you in red, dark red is the highest critical habitat. So those would be sort of our first choices for areas to work in. And then orange is more moderate and yellow is low. And so this is sort of a zoomed in example of how that would look with these lines are essentially the riparian area buffer zone. So this is an example from the Cowichan area. We're working in the Coquesila River watershed there. So it would help us determine specifically which parcels or which landowners to go and approach, right? You can see the parcel maps there. So it's a really effective tool. It's very robust in terms of the science that's behind it. And we're really happy that we've been able to get that done in this first year or so. Here's a better map, just kind of showing you where those sites were. So as I mentioned, we had a 50 goal target. By the end of the first year, we had 47 farms under target. We actually were able to secure the 50, but 3 of them hadn't returned their contracts signed on time by the deadline. So we just missed that by the March 31st deadline, but we're really happy to have these 47 sites. The blue markers here represent riparian sites. So there's some in the Upper Kootenays as well. And then the orange sites are the grassland sites. So of the 47 sites, 28 of them were involved in the riparian project, 19 were involved in the grasslands project, and 2 farms actually were able to participate in both based on the mapping that we did. So it was quite interesting to see some of these really, really high priority farms getting involved. I thought I'd give an example here from one of the sites that we worked on in Langley. So this is just showing you the geosource map for the site itself. We've been contracting with LEPS to undertake the restoration work. And here you can just see some of the work that was done installing new trees, shrubs, willow, installation of beaver caging, for example. A lot of invasive species also have to be taken out sometimes. Here's another example of the caging that gets put around the trees to protect them. This one on the right is really interesting, showing you just quite how detailed the work has to be in some cases. You can imagine the amount of labor involved. So this in particular was to try to repair the riparian area around a pond. And so you can see the stakes that were installed and the fencing as well. This picture here happens to be along the Coquesila River on Vancouver Island, where you can see there's farming really happening almost right up into the riverbank. And so the riverbank itself was getting quite badly eroded. And so this is an initial site inspection just to see how the river behaves and what kind of work needs to be done. This is that same site, so you can see some of the staking and the planting that they started to undertake there. This just shows some of the conditions under which people are working. A lot of the site work happens in the late fall and over the winter because the farming season makes it such that we don't want to be disturbing the agricultural activity. So we really have to wait until harvest season's over. In the Coquesila, it's mostly dairy farms. There's a lot of hay production that happens right up until the late fall. So we're often waiting until we can access the sites. And then of course they're quite wet. So there's often a bit of a dance in terms of the timeline of the work getting done. Here again, you can see just overgrown riparian area and the haying that was happening almost right up into the edge here. So a degraded area to be worked on. And then again, some planting of the trees and the riparian plantings here on this farm in the Coquesila. So in terms of those impacts, I mentioned we had 47 farms under contract, 27 of which were participating in the BMPs for riparian areas, 18 for grasslands, and 2 for both. And so what that translated to was over 1,500 hectares of grasslands under some form of targeted grazing program or protection from livestock grazing. A lot of that involves fencing and rotational grazing, for example. So we had 1,500 hectares of grasslands under contract. We had 140,000 meters squared of riparian areas that were restored, and that translates to 5,000 meters or 5 kilometers of water course length. So it's pretty substantial, and we're very proud of those initial steps that were undertaken. So I mentioned we have some opportunities to scale up with some of the additional funding that we received this year. We are looking at significant funding boosts, and I'll just give a shout out to our funders here. We have received funding from the federal government through the Environment Climate Change Canada Habitat Stewardship Program. We also have Provincial Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, just 2 C's there, funding from the ministry, from the Provincial Ministry of Agriculture and Food. Also, the new CAP program, so that previously was the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which is a federal provincial initiative. And for the next 5 years, the new program is going to be called the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership. And there's a new program called the Resilient Agricultural Landscapes Program, and we're going to be participating in that program and receiving some funding there as well. We also undertook a really interesting pilot project within Farmland Advantage this year to work with the BC Wildfire Service. So looking at farms that are really on the interface between wildfire threats on crown lands and cities or communities, farms that are on the fringe in between them, and working to do things like thinning forests, making sure that regrowth isn't happening in certain areas so that it's targeted, but it really reduces the threat of wildfire spread. And that's been really, really successful, and we're hoping to continue with that project. One of the reasons why it's really unique is that BC Wildfire Service doesn't tend to work specifically on private property. And so Farmland Advantage offers this really unique position where we can do that work with private landowners. And so we're able to accept public funding to really administer and undertake that work. And often Crown corporations aren't able to do that directly. So it's kind of an interesting opportunity there. We have some additional site targets for this year. We'd like to hit 100. We know that we have a lot of people who would like to join the program. We have a very long waiting list, new watersheds and new regions that would like to participate. So at the moment, we are making sure that we have not only the financial resources to do that, but also the human resources to do that. So one of the pinch points is potentially finding groups like LEPs in other areas to undertake the restoration work. Labor has been tricky for everyone this year. So labor and the planning advisors to do the health assessments as well. And then in not only new sites or new farms, but extending the work that's already started. So just because we have a farm participate doesn't mean that all the work gets done in one season. So we're often extending our work onto existing sites over several years. And then we are also looking into adding different ecosystem targets. I mentioned wetland restoration and estuary restoration, and that would require, of course, some methodology work. So we're starting to talk about that internally a bit. In terms of the sites that we added already this year, so in 2021, we were working in Surrey and Langley in the Little Campbell River and Bertrand Creek watersheds. We were working on Vancouver Island in the Coxsilo River watershed near Cowichan. In the East Kootenays, we were working in the Upper Columbia River and the Shuswap River, and in the South Okanagan, Caribou, and Upper Columbia, we were working on grassland sites. And then this year we added the Agassiz Slough in Eastern Fraser Valley, Black Creek on Vancouver Island, some sites around Creston Valley and Grand Forks for riparian. And so as I mentioned, we're trying to continue the restoration work as required. We're maintaining those beneficial management practices and verifying that they're being maintained by farmers. And we're adding a few new sites for each region. Of course, our focus is always on species at risk and also salmon habitat and ensuring that water quality and quantity is maintained. I would be remiss to say, if I didn't mention that there are key challenges, of course, with any new project. Going from 0 to 100 is hard. And we did do a deep dive this past year in our impact report, and we did come up with 5 key challenges that we identified. So I'll just share them briefly here. The first is that budgeting was really hard for the restoration work because costs were varying widely depending on the site and the type of work that needed to be done. So it's not enough to say that we're just going to give each property, allocate to each property like $3,000 or $5,000 or $10,000, because some properties need $20,000 worth of work to be done and others need 2. And we don't know what that's going to look like until all the prescriptions are completed. And so at the beginning of the year, for example, we say we want to do 50 sites, but if all those 50 sites come back saying that they need, the maximum amount of funding to do the restoration work, then we're going to be in trouble. So there's a bit of a dance there, and really getting that detailed documentation to track how the funding is being used and what the costs are will be easier. Everything just costs more year over year too, and so that's challenging to predict. But the second one was that the long-term sources of funding continue to be elusive. That's getting a little bit better, but the longer-term funding we have, so 1 year is great, 2 years is better, 5 years is fantastic, then we're able to enter into longer-term contracts with farmers. The contracts are a challenge because it's a lot of not just physical paperwork, but sometimes digital paperwork as well. And we want to try and make that as streamlined as possible for producers. Number 3 was that we do have a lot of funders that are interested in providing us with resources, but they often have different priorities. So for example, one organization might be interested in salmon habitat protection, another one might be interested in grasslands protection. So I think it's incumbent upon us as an organization to really explicitly communicate out what our goals and missions are and make sure that we don't deviate too much to go along with what funders are looking for. The fourth one was a real challenge operationally, and that was that funding deadlines didn't always align with the seasonality of the work that needed to be done. So March 31st, everything needs to be spent, and oftentimes restoration work isn't completed because of winter weather. So that's something that with these longer term funding arrangements, hopefully we'll be able to come up with a better schedule to make things easier on the ground for those who are doing the work. And then lastly, and hopefully again, this will kind of take care of itself, but with the COVID-19 precautions at the time, it was really hard for us to do in-person meetings. We were hoping to do a lot more of those celebration events with Indigenous communities, and we tried a few times in other communities, but they often had to be canceled. We did get to do a great event last fall, though, with Cowichan tribes in Coxsila River watershed, and we're hoping to do some more in the months to come as well. So I think I mentioned our funders. We've been really lucky to have a diversity of funding. It's always important to have a diversity of funding. And one thing that Dave Zender was really critically keen on when he started this program was that he didn't want agriculture to pay for this work. So it was really an important priority for him that funding was going to be coming from a variety of sources and ministries, and it wasn't just going to be coming from Ministry of Agriculture. And to this day, I mean, we've seen Ministry of Agriculture be an important partner, but we've also seen funding from various sources. So that's been really great. Another testament to the success of the project. So that's it. Thank you for your time. This is the email that you can contact the program at. As I mentioned, it is a very targeted program at this point in time, but there's no harm in letting us know if you are interested, because we will be sure to put you on a waiting list, or in the case, if your watershed is already under the program, then we will try our best to reach out and check in upon the ability to bring you into the program. So thank you very much, and I appreciate it. Have a good night.